The Pentagon is calling about a prisoner. The words echoed through the police station so quietly at first that nobody paid attention. Phones rang. Keyboards clicked. Officers moved between desks carrying paperwork and coffee cups. It was just another afternoon in Norfolk, Virginia, another ordinary day inside a building where people came and went without leaving much of an impression. But 5 minutes earlier, nobody inside that station would have believed those words could change everything. At that moment, in a holding room tucked behind a long gray hallway, Marcus Reed sat alone on a metal bench beneath a flickering fluorescent light. The room was small, cold, and silent except for the distant hum of air vents pushing stale air through the building. Marcus rested his hands on his knees and stared at the floor. He looked remarkably calm for a man who had just been locked up. No pacing. No complaints. No anger. Just patience. Across the room, Officer Ryan Walker leaned against the doorway with his arms folded across his chest. At 42 years old, Ryan had spent nearly 2 decades wearing a badge. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed experience made him right. His uniform was spotless. His posture was rigid. His expression carried the kind of certainty that left little room for doubt. To him, this situation was simple. Marcus Reed had shown attitude. That was how Ryan explained it to anyone who asked. Not a crime. Not a threat. Just attitude. Ryan glanced into the room and shook his head. You know, he said, his voice breaking the silence, most people figure out pretty quickly that arguing doesn't help. Marcus slowly lifted his eyes. His face remained relaxed. I wasn't arguing. Ryan let out a short laugh. Sure looked like it from where I was standing. Marcus didn't answer. The silence seemed to bother Ryan more than any response could have. He shifted his weight and stared at the man on the bench. There was something unsettling about how calm Marcus remained. Most people grew nervous when they found themselves behind a locked door. Most people asked questions. Most people demanded explanations. Marcus did none of those things. He simply sat there as though he were waiting for a train instead of sitting inside a police station. Ryan checked his watch and smirked. You could save yourself some trouble if you learned when to keep your opinions to yourself. Again, no response. Marcus merely looked back at the floor. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Somewhere beyond the hallway, a printer came to life. The station continued operating exactly as it always had. Nobody noticed the subtle tension hanging in the air. Nobody noticed that something felt different. Ryan pushed himself away from the doorway. Enjoy your time in there, he said before walking away. The heavy door closed with a metallic click. Marcus listened to the sound fade into silence. Then he slowly leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. Not because he was worried. Not because he was afraid. Because he knew something nobody else in that building knew. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, a secure phone line had already begun to ring. 4 hours earlier, the day had looked completely different. The spring sun hung low over Norfolk Harbor, painting the water with streaks of gold while a cool breeze rolled in from the Chesapeake Bay. People moved through the city without hurry, enjoying a quiet afternoon that felt ordinary in every possible way. Marcus Reed walked along a sidewalk near the waterfront carrying a paper bag from a small neighborhood grocery store. Dressed in a simple dark jacket and blue jeans, he blended easily into the crowd. Nobody stopped to look at him twice. Nobody recognized his name. That was exactly how Marcus preferred it. As he crossed a narrow street lined with brick storefronts, he noticed an elderly man sitting alone on a bench near a bus stop. The man's weathered jacket carried the faded insignia of a military unit from decades earlier. A worn duffel bag rested beside him. Most people walked past without noticing. Marcus slowed his pace. Something about the man's posture caught his attention. The quiet dignity. The tired eyes. The unmistakable look of someone who had spent years carrying responsibilities few others could understand. Marcus approached with a warm smile. "Afternoon, sir." The older man looked up and returned a small nod. "Afternoon." Marcus sat beside him and handed over a bottle of water from the grocery bag. The man hesitated before accepting it. "Thank you." For the next 20 minutes they talked about simple things. The weather. The city. Baseball. Neither man raised his voice. Neither seemed interested in drawing attention. A few people passing by assumed they were old friends catching up after years apart. What nobody could see was the quiet respect shared between two men connected by service, sacrifice, and discipline. Eventually the older man glanced at the insignia pin attached to Marcus's jacket. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You served?" Marcus smiled politely. "A long time ago." The answer was brief, but it seemed to satisfy the question. The older man nodded. "I figured." A moment later a city bus pulled to the curb. Before stepping aboard, the man turned back. "People do not always know who they are looking at." Marcus laughed softly. "That is probably true." The bus disappeared down the street. Marcus watched it go before continuing his walk. The conversation lingered in his thoughts. Over the years he had learned that respect often revealed more about a person than authority ever could. A few blocks later he entered a small government services building to ask a routine question regarding a public records request. It should have taken 5 minutes. 10 at most. Instead, a misunderstanding began to unfold. A disagreement over procedure. A few questions asked calmly. A few assumptions made too quickly. Marcus remained polite throughout the exchange, but not everyone interpreted confidence the same way. By the time he stepped back outside, several people were watching. Among them stood Officer Ryan Walker. Their eyes met for the first time that afternoon. Ryan saw a man he believed was being difficult. Marcus saw an officer already forming conclusions. Neither realized that a simple encounter was about to set events in motion that would reach far beyond a city street in Norfolk, Virginia. Ryan Walker had dealt with thousands of people throughout his career, and in his mind, Marcus Reed was no different. As he approached the entrance of the government services building, he noticed a small group gathered near the front steps. Some people were waiting for paperwork. Others were simply watching the discussion that had formed near the information desk inside. The moment Ryan stepped through the doors, he sensed the tension. It was not loud. Nobody was shouting. In fact, the room was surprisingly calm. Marcus stood near the counter speaking with an employee in a measured voice. His posture was relaxed. His hands remained at his sides. Yet Ryan immediately focused on him. The employee behind the counter looked frustrated. A supervisor had already been called over. Several visitors watched quietly from nearby chairs. Ryan approached with the confidence of someone used to taking control of a situation. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked. The supervisor exhaled. "Just a disagreement about a records request." Marcus turned toward the officer. "There is no problem. I am simply asking for clarification regarding a public document." Ryan studied him carefully. There was something about Marcus's calm demeanor that bothered him. Perhaps it was the way he maintained eye contact. Perhaps it was the certainty in his voice. Whatever the reason, Ryan interpreted it as defiance. "If they gave you an answer, then you have your answer," Ryan said. Marcus nodded politely. "And I am asking for the legal basis behind that answer." The room grew quiet. Ryan folded his arms. "Sounds like you are making this more difficult than it needs to be." Marcus remained composed. "Respectfully, officer, asking questions is not the same thing as causing trouble." Several people nearby exchanged glances. The conversation itself was ordinary. Yet the atmosphere continued to tighten. Ryan felt as though his authority was being challenged, even though Marcus had never raised his voice once. Sometimes people need to know when a conversation is over, Ryan said firmly. Marcus looked at him for a moment before responding. Sometimes conversations end when people receive the information they requested. The words were calm. Reasonable. But Ryan heard something different. He heard attitude. Around them, the afternoon sunlight streamed through the large front windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The building remained quiet except for the distant hum of air conditioning and the occasional rustle of paperwork. Yet Ryan felt increasingly irritated. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed completely unaffected. The contrast only deepened Ryan's frustration. Imagine standing there, speaking calmly, while another person becomes more convinced that your confidence is a problem. Imagine knowing that every word you choose carefully is somehow being interpreted in the worst possible way. Marcus understood that feeling all too well. He had experienced it before. Ryan took a step closer. I think it is time for you to leave. Marcus glanced toward the supervisor. I still have unfinished business here. The supervisor looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Silence settled over the room. The kind of silence that arrives just before a situation changes direction. Nobody knew it yet, but the decision Ryan made during the next few minutes would soon travel far beyond the walls of that government building. And somewhere else, far from Norfolk, a chain of events had already begun moving toward him. The supervisor shifted uneasily behind the counter. A few visitors quietly gathered their belongings and moved closer to the exits, sensing that the atmosphere inside the building had changed. Nobody was shouting. Nobody was causing a scene. Yet the tension felt heavy enough to fill every corner of the room. Ryan Walker looked at Marcus Reed and saw a man refusing to back down. Marcus looked at Ryan and saw a man who had already decided what kind of person he believed he was dealing with. I am asking you one final time, Ryan said. Leave the building. Marcus remained calm. I have followed every instruction that has been given to me. I am simply requesting information that is available through public process. Ryan's jaw tightened. To him, every answer sounded like another challenge. The supervisor finally stepped forward. Maybe we should all take a moment and slow down. But Ryan was no longer interested in slowing down. The certainty inside his mind had already taken over. He believed he was maintaining order. He believed he was handling a difficult situation. Most importantly, he believed he was right. Marcus glanced around the room. Several people watched silently. Some appeared uncomfortable. Others looked away entirely. It was a familiar sight. People often preferred not to become involved when they sensed authority taking control of a situation. Officer, Marcus said carefully, I am not refusing any lawful request. I am only asking for clarification. Ryan shook his head. You keep saying that. The room fell quiet again. Outside the large front windows, afternoon traffic continued moving through the city. Cars passed. Pedestrians crossed intersections. Life continued as normal. Yet inside the building, a decision was being made that would alter the course of the entire day. Within minutes, Ryan chose to remove Marcus from the property and transport him to the station for further processing. Several witnesses exchanged surprised looks. The supervisor appeared stunned but did not object. Marcus offered no resistance. He gathered his belongings, cooperated fully, and walked out of the building under Ryan's direction. What struck many observers was not what Marcus said. It was what he did not say. No angry words. No dramatic speeches. No attempts to attract attention. Just quiet cooperation. As they arrived at the station later that afternoon, Ryan felt a growing sense of satisfaction. In his mind, he had resolved a problem. Another difficult citizen. Another situation brought under control. Meanwhile Marcus sat quietly in an interview room while paperwork moved through the system. A young desk officer glanced through the file and frowned. There was almost nothing there. No criminal history. No outstanding issues. No warning flags. Just basic information and routine identification records. That is strange, the officer muttered. Another employee looked over his shoulder. What is? Nothing. Just expected more. Across the hallway, Ryan signed forms and spoke confidently with colleagues about the encounter. Most listened without question. Yet one veteran sergeant remained unusually quiet. Something about the story felt incomplete. Something about Marcus Reed did not fit the picture Ryan was painting. And while conversations continued inside the station, hundreds of miles away a secure office received an unexpected notification. A name had appeared in a system where it should never have appeared. Within moments, phones began ringing. Emails were forwarded. Questions were asked. And for the first time that day, people with far greater authority than anyone inside the Norfolk Police Department started paying very close attention. Back at the station, the afternoon stretched on with the slow rhythm of routine police work. Officers answered calls, completed reports, and moved between desks beneath the pale glow of fluorescent lights. To most people inside the building, Marcus Reed had already become an afterthought. He was simply another name on a form, another person waiting behind a closed door while paperwork worked its way through the system. Yet small details were beginning to attract attention. The young desk officer who had reviewed Marcus's file could not shake the feeling that something was unusual. He opened the record again and studied it more carefully. There was almost nothing there. No disciplinary history. No criminal record. No warnings. No flags. For a man approaching 40 years old, the file seemed remarkably clean. Even stranger, several sections that normally contained routine background information appeared restricted. Not deleted. Not missing. Restricted. The officer frowned and leaned back in his chair. Across the room, another employee processed Marcus's personal belongings. Among them was a worn leather wallet, a simple wristwatch, and a small key ring. Nothing appeared remarkable at first glance. Yet tucked inside the wallet was an old photograph. The employee paused. In the picture, Marcus stood beside several men and women wearing military uniforms. Their expressions were proud but professional. No names appeared on the image. No explanation accompanied it. The employee looked closer before setting it aside. Meanwhile, Marcus remained seated quietly in the holding room. The same buzzing light hung overhead. The same cold air drifted through the vent above the door. Yet he appeared completely at ease. He checked the wall clock once and then folded his hands again. As though he were waiting for something. Or someone. Imagine sitting in a room where everyone assumes they understand your story while knowing they have only seen the first page. Imagine hearing people draw conclusions about you without realizing how much remains hidden. Marcus had learned long ago that the truth often arrived on its own schedule. Down the hallway, Ryan Walker continued speaking confidently about the events at the government building. A few officers nodded along. Others listened quietly. The veteran sergeant remained unconvinced. "You said he threatened nobody?" the sergeant asked. "No, damaged nothing." "No, refused instructions?" Ryan hesitated for a second. "Not exactly." The sergeant looked thoughtful. "Then what made you believe this needed to go this far?" Ryan sighed impatiently. "Sometimes experience tells you when somebody is a problem." The sergeant said nothing. His silence lingered long after the conversation ended. At nearly the same moment, several states away, a secure administrative office received a second notification connected to Marcus Reed's name. This one triggered immediate attention. A supervisor stopped what she was doing and picked up a phone. Another employee opened a confidential database. Within minutes, multiple departments were communicating. Questions turned into concerns. Concerns turned into urgency. Back in Norfolk, nobody inside the station knew any of this was happening. They could not hear the distant phone calls. They could not see the messages moving across secure networks. They could not feel the pressure beginning to build. But it was building. And with every passing minute, the gap between what Ryan believed and what was actually true was becoming impossible to ignore. The clock on the wall moved past another 10 minutes, yet Marcus Reed remained exactly where he had been, sitting quietly beneath the humming fluorescent light. Outside the holding room, however, the atmosphere inside the station was beginning to change in ways nobody could fully explain. The first sign came when a lieutenant received a phone call and suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but when he hung up, the expression on his face had changed. He immediately walked toward his office and closed the door behind him. A few officers noticed. Most ignored it. Ryan Walker certainly ignored it. He was still convinced the situation would soon be forgotten. After all, from his perspective, there was nothing unusual about what had happened. Yet unusual things were happening. Across multiple offices hundreds of miles away, Marcus Reed's name continued moving through secure channels. People who rarely paid attention to local incidents were now asking questions. Why had his name appeared in civilian processing records? Why had an automated notification been triggered? Why had a routine detention generated alerts inside systems that almost never produced alerts at all? One supervisor opened a restricted file and stared silently at the screen. Another immediately requested verification from a separate department. The responses arrived quickly. Too quickly. That alone told them how seriously the matter was being treated. Back in Norfolk, the veteran sergeant walked past the holding room and glanced through the small window in the door. Marcus looked up and offered a polite nod. The sergeant paused. There was no fear in the man's eyes. No frustration. No resentment. Only patience. "You doing all right in there?" the sergeant asked. "I am fine," Marcus replied. "Thank you for asking." The answer lingered with the sergeant long after he walked away. Something about Marcus's calm confidence felt impossible to ignore. Most people placed in unfamiliar situations became anxious. Marcus seemed almost certain that events would resolve themselves. Meanwhile, the young desk officer continued examining the restricted portions of the file. Every attempt to access additional information produced the same response. Access denied. Clearance required. He had never seen anything quite like it. Not for an ordinary citizen. Not for someone with no criminal history. He finally pushed his chair back and muttered under his breath, "Who exactly are you?" As afternoon drifted toward evening, clouds gathered outside the station windows. The sunlight faded, replaced by the cool gray tones of approaching dusk. Inside the building, conversations grew quieter. A sense of anticipation settled over the staff even though nobody understood its source. Then another phone rang. This time it was not a routine call. A dispatcher answered, listened for several seconds, and immediately straightened in her chair. Nearby officers watched as her expression shifted from confusion to concern. "One moment, sir," she said carefully. "I will transfer you immediately." The call moved up the chain of command. Then higher. Then higher still. Doors opened. Supervisors emerged from offices. Questions began spreading through the station like ripples across still water. Nobody knew exactly what was happening yet. But everyone could feel it. Somewhere beyond those walls, a powerful machine had awakened. And it was moving in only one direction. The station had grown unusually quiet. Conversations that normally filled the halls had faded into whispers. Officers who had spent the last hour focused on routine paperwork now found themselves watching supervisors move quickly between offices with expressions they had never seen before. Ryan Walker stood near the report desk, still unaware of how dramatically the situation had shifted. He noticed the tension but assumed it was related to something else. A major case. A departmental issue. Anything except the man sitting quietly in the holding room. Then the chief's office phone rang. The sound itself was unremarkable, but what happened afterward was not. The administrative assistant answered, listened for only a few seconds, and immediately stood up. Her face lost all color. Without saying a word, she carried the call directly into the chief's office. The door closed. Less than 30 seconds later, it opened again. The chief emerged with a look that instantly captured everyone's attention. "Where is Officer Walker?" he asked. The room fell silent. Ryan stepped forward. "Right here, sir." The chief stared at him for a moment. "Come with me." Inside the office, the atmosphere felt different. Heavy. Controlled. Serious. A speakerphone sat on the desk. A voice was already waiting on the line. Calm. Professional. Precise. "Officer Walker?" the voice asked. "Yes, sir. This is Deputy Director Charles Hensley. I am calling on behalf of the Department of Defense." Ryan blinked. For a moment, he thought he had misunderstood. The Department of Defense. The words did not seem connected to anything that had happened that afternoon. "Sir?" Ryan asked cautiously. "We have reason to believe that Marcus Reed is currently being held in your facility." The room became completely still. Ryan glanced at the chief. The chief said nothing. "Yes," Ryan finally answered. "He is." Another brief pause followed. "You will release Mr. Reed immediately." Ryan felt his stomach tighten. "May I ask why?" The voice remained calm. "No. You may not." The answer landed with surprising force. Not because it was hostile. Because it carried absolute certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from authority operating at a level few people ever encounter. "You are also instructed to preserve all records related to today's events, including communications, reports, and surveillance footage." Ryan stared at the speakerphone. The chief stared at Ryan. Neither spoke. The voice continued. "Mr. Reed has committed no crime. Additional representatives are already reviewing the circumstances surrounding this detention." Somewhere down the hallway, a door opened. Footsteps echoed across the floor. Phones continued ringing throughout the station. Yet inside that office, it felt as though time had stopped. Ryan thought back to the government building. The conversation. The questions. The assumptions. Every decision that had seemed obvious a few hours earlier suddenly felt very different. Then came the final sentence. "Officer Walker," the voice said, "the individual you detained is involved in work that requires protections far beyond local jurisdiction. That is all you need to know." The line disconnected. Silence followed. And for the first time all day, Ryan Walker realized he had never truly understood who Marcus Reed was. The realization spread through the station faster than any official announcement could have. Officers who had been casually moving through their shifts now spoke in hushed voices. Supervisors gathered in offices behind closed doors. Computer screens displayed reports that suddenly mattered far more than they had an hour earlier. The atmosphere had changed completely. Ryan Walker stepped out of the chief's office feeling as though the floor beneath him had shifted. The confidence that had carried him through the afternoon was gone. In its place was uncertainty. For the first time, he found himself replaying every moment of the encounter. Every assumption. Every conclusion. Every opportunity he had ignored. Meanwhile, Marcus Reed remained seated in the holding room exactly as before. The fluorescent light still buzzed overhead. The wall clock continued its steady march forward. Yet the difference now was that everyone else had finally begun to understand that Marcus was not the person they had assumed he was. The veteran sergeant arrived first. He opened the door and looked inside. Marcus lifted his eyes and offered the same calm expression he had worn all day. "Mr. Reed," the sergeant said respectfully, "there has been a change in circumstances." Marcus nodded slightly as though he had expected those words. "I understand." The sergeant paused. "You seem remarkably unsurprised." A faint smile appeared on Marcus's face. "People usually find the truth eventually." The answer lingered in the air. A few minutes later, additional calls reached the station. This time they came from officials whose names carried significant weight. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody issued threats. They did not need to. Their concern alone was enough to command immediate attention. The message remained consistent. Preserve every record. Review every decision. Ensure full compliance. Inside administrative offices, reports were examined line by line. Supervisors compared timelines. Witness statements were requested. Security footage was flagged for review. What had begun as an ordinary afternoon had evolved into something entirely different. Imagine discovering that a story you believed was simple was actually connected to a much larger picture. Imagine realizing that the person sitting quietly in front of you had never relied on status, titles, or recognition to command respect. Marcus had walked into the government building dressed like any other citizen. He had spoken politely. He had asked questions. And because he appeared ordinary, people had assumed he was powerless. Yet somewhere beyond Norfolk, individuals responsible for matters of national importance had immediately recognized his name. That fact alone spoke volumes. As evening settled outside, rain began tapping softly against the station windows. The city lights reflected across wet pavement. Inside the building, conversations continued, but their tone had changed. There was less certainty. More reflection. More caution. The chief eventually approached the holding room personally. He stopped outside the door for a moment before entering. Marcus stood as the door opened. Neither man spoke immediately. The silence felt respectful rather than uncomfortable. Finally, the chief extended his hand. "Mr. Reed, I believe we have some things to discuss." Marcus looked at him calmly. "I believe we do." And for the first time that day, the station stopped treating Marcus Reed like a problem and started treating him like a person. The rain continued falling outside as the final pieces of the story settled into place. The review that followed moved quickly. Security footage was examined. Witness statements were collected. Timelines were compared. The facts spoke for themselves. Nobody needed dramatic revelations anymore because the truth was already sitting plainly in front of everyone. Inside the station, conversations became more thoughtful than defensive. Officers who had watched the situation unfold began reflecting on how easily assumptions could shape decisions. Supervisors focused on procedures. Administrators focused on accountability. The goal was no longer to defend what had happened but to understand how it had happened. Marcus Reed spent nearly an hour speaking privately with department leadership. He answered questions calmly and respectfully. He never raised his voice. He never demanded special treatment. In fact, what surprised people most was how little interest he seemed to have in discussing himself. Eventually, fragments of the truth emerged. Marcus had spent years contributing to projects connected to national defense and strategic planning. Much of his work remained protected by confidentiality requirements. The details were not shared. They could not be shared. But one fact became impossible to ignore. The people who called on his behalf were not reacting because of status. They were reacting because his responsibilities mattered. A great deal. Later that evening, Marcus stepped into the station lobby carrying the same simple belongings he had arrived with earlier that day. The building felt different now. Officers who had barely noticed him before looked up as he passed. Some offered polite nods. Others simply watched in silence. Ryan Walker stood near the front entrance. For several seconds neither man spoke. The sound of rain tapping against the glass filled the space between them. Ryan looked older than he had a few hours earlier. Not because time had passed, but because certainty had disappeared. I made assumptions, Ryan finally said. Marcus regarded him quietly. Yes. Ryan lowered his eyes. I should have listened more carefully. The words hung in the air. Honest. Uncomfortable. Necessary. Marcus nodded slowly. Most problems begin when people stop listening. Ryan did not argue. He could not. Deep down he already knew it was true. Imagine spending an entire day believing you understood someone, only to discover you never really saw them at all. Imagine learning that respect should never depend on a title, a position, a uniform, or a clearance level. Marcus had not become worthy of dignity when the phone calls arrived. He had been worthy of dignity from the very beginning. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted him. Streetlights reflected across the wet pavement. Traffic moved steadily through the city. Life carried on exactly as it always had. Marcus paused beneath the glow of a lamp and looked toward the distant skyline. Then he continued walking into the night. Behind him, the station remained illuminated against the darkness. Ahead of him, the road stretched forward. Beneath the falling rain. And perhaps the most important lesson of all was this: the strongest people are often the ones who never need to announce their strength, because true character is not revealed by how much power someone holds, but by how much respect they show before they know who is standing in front of them.